Bom dia, eu sou Cristiane Mesquita e, antes de mais nada, preciso agradecer, né? Agradecer a vocês, convidados que estão aqui hoje, e aos nossos convidados que estarão aqui nas mesas, que estiveram ontem nas oficinas e que estarão amanhã conosco. É importante dizer que eles estão conosco nesse evento generosamente, gentilmente, né? Porque compartilhar suas pesquisas, suas inquietações, seus trabalhos, por uma espécie de compromisso aí com essa ideia de estar, né, produzindo reverberação para isso, e o ziguezague está sendo esse espaço nesse momento. A FAPESP, né, que apoiou a vinda do nosso convidado de abertura, que logo estará aqui com a gente. Ao ItauCultural, que topou receber o ziguezague hoje e amanhã, e que nos apoia com esse espaço, com a tradução simultânea de hoje. Então, a Cat, que me recebeu, né, com a proposta, a Paula e a Lorena, que seguiram aí toda a equipe. Ao PPG Design, onde eu trabalho, meus companheiros, meus alunos, meus orientandos, né? Especialmente ao nosso anjo da guarda, Antônia, que não está aqui hoje, mas que é responsável por muito da nossa realização, aí sempre apoiando. A Raquel, nossa coordenadora, que também é sempre uma forte presença aí para as coisas acontecerem. Ao Instituto de Artes da Unicamp, nosso parceiro nessa realização através do grupo de pesquisa Ornata, e aos meus orientandos, integrantes do grupo de estudos ziguezague, cada um, né, com a sua missão aí, Marcos, Robson, Ana Rita, Lucas, né, Diogo, todo mundo animado aí, super estamos juntos, né, para fazer isso acontecer. A Paula também, que vai estar dando uma força também no acompanhamento do Gavin, a Leila, que acabou de chegar, inclusive, e a Mariana, né, que está lá embaixo agora, que é responsável por grande parte do acompanhamento da nossa organização e produção desde o começo. E é importante dizer que esse começo tem 2 anos, né? Para a gente estar aqui hoje, foram 2 anos correndo atrás, e a Mariana esteve com a gente. Ela é minha ex, ela já é mestre, foi me orientando, quer dizer, nem trabalhou mesmo pelo compromisso de estar realizando isso. E Ana Paula, né, parceira aqui dos últimos anos, e realmente eu acho que só os deuses sabem quanto a gente conspirou para isso aqui de fato estar acontecendo hoje. Eu vou comentar muito rapidamente sobre o conceito de zigue-zague, que é um conceito que eu venho pesquisando ao longo dos últimos 10 anos, né, desde que eu prestei atenção na proposição que o Gilles Deleuze, um filósofo francês, né, na proposição que ele faz sobre a letra Z no abecedário, né? E essa geometria ele trata de uma forma muito singular, e desde que eu criei uma certa aliança com ela, eu passei a exercitar esse conceito, a cavalgar esse conceito, a colocar ele a meu, né, dispor de diferentes maneiras. Isso já tomou diferentes formas ao longo da minha história, da minha pesquisa, até do meu corpo, eu diria. Esse zigue-zague já tomou forma. E quando eu propus, né, o primeiro zigue-zague evento, né, na forma de evento, que foi em 2007, a convite do MAN, essa ideia, né, do zigue-zague foi o que nos ajudou a formatar as mesas. Ou seja, propor encontros que pudessem exercitar uma espécie de processo de criação, né? Ou seja, produzir algo entre. Fazer a erva crescer pelo meio, né? Palavras de Deleuze e Guattari aí falando dessa ideia. Promover encontros entre diferentes potenciais cujo resultado não possa habitar nenhum lugar nem o outro de origem. Em outras palavras, a ideia é colocar um tema para vibrar, e é isso que a gente está começando a fazer aqui hoje, né? A partir de diferentes perspectivas que possam multiplicar as reflexões, as práticas em torno de um assunto, sempre pensando esse assunto a partir das diferenças que possam cruzar com ele. Então, fazer zigue-zague é, para mim, uma prática muito necessária. Ela tem a ver com algumas inquietações minhas, que em determinado momento se encontraram com inquietações da Ana Paula, e no sentido de criar um certo respiro, ou respiros, né, na prática do cotidiano dito acadêmico, né? É algo muito, muito além disso que faz a gente estar aqui hoje, né, depois desse trabalho para fazer essa realização, entre criar um projeto, correr atrás de grana, não conseguir grana e fazer assim mesmo, né? E isso é uma espécie de vício para mim, criar esses respiros, né? Quando eu olho para a minha trajetória, eu venho praticando isso e é mesmo correr atrás de um certo respiro, né? Em algumas... poder contaminar de reflexões um campo que talvez pudesse estar a serviço da anestesia do pensamento, né? Então, eu venho praticando isso e é assim que eu coloco o zigue-zague a nosso favor. Ou seja, conspirar em favor de mais questões do que de respostas, talvez eu pudesse dizer, tentar produzir diagramas que possam vibrar algumas questões, que possam colocar em prática uma certa criação de possíveis, né? Ou seja, algumas paisagens que possam ampliar em cada um de nós, em cada um de vocês, eu espero, modos de ver e modos de existir, né? Dessa forma, ou melhor, nesta forma, né, em zigue-zague, vale contar um pouco sobre os nossos 2 disparadores. O primeiro foi uma proposição ou uma provocação do filósofo tcheco Willem Flusser, né, sobre a palavra design, que está num texto que está presente no livro Mundo Codificado. E ali o Flusser aproxima esse termo e esse verbo para a ideia de esquema maligno, traição, estratégia e conspiração, né, que na verdade, a gente então tomou como título do evento. Eu juro, né, sem nunca imaginar que essa palavra, neste momento, estaria atravessando tanto, né, nossa existência nesse país. Então, realmente, há uma espécie de coincidência que nos comove, né, nesse sentido, e talvez isso esteja vibrando, certamente está em cada um de nós aqui hoje. Em segundo momento, a exposição, né, Objetos Desobedientes. Quando a gente conheceu essa mostra e procurou saber mais sobre ela, a gente pensou que ali também estava uma concepção de design que subverte os princípios convencionais de como essa ideia e essa prática é tomada, e a gente achou que esse encontro, né, da proposição do Flusser e da ideia dos objetos desobedientes seria justamente colocar em movimento um zigue-zague, né, um encontro entre 2 ideias que nos movimenta. Assim sendo, eu vou passar a palavra para a Ana, que também vai falar rapidamente, e depois eu vou apresentar os nossos convidados de hoje. Então, de novo, bem-vindos, obrigada pela presença. E o mais zigue-zagueante é tudo isso, né? É justamente ver as diagonais, quem sabe, agirem como raios em cada um de vocês. Obrigada.
Bom dia, eu sou a Ana. Vou colocar só um pouquinho sobre essa parceria que foi traçada, né, no encontro meu e da Cris há 2 anos atrás, para projetar esse evento. Eu trabalho lá na Unicamp e o nosso grupo de pesquisa tem um certo alinhamento com esse modo de pensar que a Cris acabou de colocar aqui para vocês. A gente não trabalha com zigue-zague. A nossa pesquisa tem frequentado a ideia da fronteira. A minha formação original é em design, com trânsitos e frequências nas áreas da arte e da filosofia, mestrado, doutorado e agora no grupo de pesquisa. Então, essa ideia de estar nas bordas, de estar nas fronteiras, de não estar ocupando espaços pré-determinados e muito circunscritos dos campos, é que nos aproxima dessa ideia de zigue-zague que vem do grupo de pesquisa da Cris. E aí, então, essa vontade de romper com essas formas clássicas de pensar o design via função ou via a questão do mercado e trabalhar com uma ideia de design que é uma ação no mundo, né? E que tem, por isso, um compromisso que é estético, que é poético e que é político. Então, a gente desloca um pouco desse lugar mais tradicional, onde o design se coloca e a arte, a filosofia vem ajudar a gente a puxar para esse outro lugar, né? O evento foi construído com uma ideia de ouvir vozes distintas, um desejo de conhecer outros campos, outros lugares e colocar isso em trânsito, né? Na nossa concepção, a fronteira é o lugar desse encontro, ela não só separa, mas ela permite esse encontro, e isso tem uma conexão muito forte com a ideia de zigue-zague que a Cris está colocando, né? Produzir esses encontros é uma forma de respiro, né? Um arejamento, é uma estratégia para a gente, mais do que fomentar, é uma ideia para mim de fermentar, né, outras maneiras de pensar e de criar. O formato que a gente deu para esse evento, né, conversas transversais, oficinas transitivas, é reforçando a ideia de trânsito, né, de trânsito de lugares. Os convidados, eles não pertencem ao mesmo campo, na verdade a gente produz esse encontro desses campos específicos de cada convidado, e a ideia é que realmente esse movimento produza algo diferente. Justamente por isso, nessa ideia de atravessar, de transitar, nós optamos, ainda na questão do formato, como estratégia que não vai haver a figura de um mediador, porque para a gente essa figura ela se contrapõe à ideia de deixar esse fluxo livre. Ninguém vai ocupar esse lugar do meio. Esse lugar do meio vai ficar aberto para que esses dois convidados, ou três, ou enfim, possam conversar, trocar suas ideias, e a gente está muito interessado no diálogo que esses convidados vão ter entre si. Nosso papel aqui vai ser mais de organizar um apoio meio logístico, de tempo, enfim, né? A ideia é que essas conexões sejam mais diretas, que esses encontros sejam mais radicais e, portanto, mais potentes, e a gente possa sair daqui alimentado e perturbado, e que é isso que a gente quer, sair dos lugares de conforto. Tá? Agora a Cris vai apresentar nossos convidados.
Então, a gente vai começar com esse zigue-zague de abertura, né, que, na verdade, de início surgiu com a ideia de convidar o Gavin Grindon para uma conferência, que é o que ele vai trazer agora. Mas, logo quando a gente conheceu o trabalho e a pesquisa do André Mesquita, a gente achou que seria um bom encontro e decidiu que essa abertura vai acontecer, então, dessa forma, né? Então, de início, eu vou apresentar os dois, mas o Gavin vai falar para a gente aqui, e depois o André, então, vem e finalize. Como a Ana colocou, a ideia é que tenhamos não mediadores, mas multiplicadores, e que vocês possam, na sequência, dialogar com a gente, tá? Então, o Gavin Grindon, né, é um pesquisador do Victorian Albert Museum, onde ele fez essa exposição Disobedient Objects em 2014. Ele é professor da Universidade de Essex, e além de ter outras ações, né, pontuais em outras universidades ao longo da sua carreira. Suas pesquisas são focadas em temas como o dadaísmo, a internacional situacionista, e especialmente algumas questões da cultura material, da globalização e do ativismo, né? Então, ele vai, eu acho que ao longo da sua própria fala, contar um pouco aí de algumas dessas imersões dele. E, na sequência, a gente tem o André Mesquita, que é pesquisador das relações entre arte, política e ativismo. É doutor em História Social pela Faculdade de Filosofia, Letras e Ciências Humanas da USP. E autor de livros como Insurgências Poéticas, Arte Ativista e Ação Coletiva e Esperar Não É Saber. Arte entre o Silêncio e a Evidência. Né? Então, acho que ao longo do nosso trabalho também o André vai contar um pouco mais sobre a pesquisa dele, e aí a gente então começa com o nosso convidado.
All right, hello. So I'm going to be talking about this exhibition that I co-curated, that you just heard about, Disobedient Objects, and maybe, if there's time, another exhibition that I followed it up with that was part of Banksy's Dismal Land show last year. So Disobedient Objects was an exhibition of the art and design objects produced within activist social movements since the late 1970s, and I tried to give it quite a kind of international scope. So here's like another shot from inside the show. And one way of introducing it is to think that just inside the kind of grand entrance to the Victoria and Albert Museum, on a balcony overlooking the Disobedient Objects exhibition, there's a sculpture of Hercules. It's one of the many images of Hercules in the museum, not only in medieval European sculpture and pottery, but he resurfaces in painting in the 18th century, in ceramics, and in silver presentation vases, like this one, which would have been displayed. You can see it in the V&A now, and the label will tell you it would have been shown during a very fine dinner, which sounds nice. In the history of the revolutionary Atlantic in the 17th and 18th century, Peter Linnebauer and Marcus Rediker observed that for the classically trained architects of the Atlantic economy, Hercules represented power and order. They saw in his mythic labors their own epic imperial ambitions and aggressive economic enclosure of the world. So accordingly, they placed his image on coins, buildings, and the finely crafted objects of their domestic lives. Hercules' second labor in the myth was to destroy the Hydra of Lena, which you see him doing here on this vase, in whose image these leaders of state and industry saw the opposite image of resistance and disorder. It was an unruly monster, part whirlwind, part woman, part snake, and its heads for them represented slave revolts, piracy, peasant rebellions, and urban unrest. And every time Hercules sliced off one of its heads, two more sprung up in its place. And eventually he kills the beast, and dipping his arrows in the slain beast's blood, he harnesses its power for his own future triumphs. So the question for me was, what about the objects on the other side of this story? We don't know as much about how these rebels represented themselves and their oppressors through objects and images as we do about the many images of Hercules all the way through the museum, which was founded at the height of this moment of colonial enclosure. So I began to think about kind of what would it mean to put on an exhibition for the Hydra. And Disobedient Objects is concerned with these forms of mass popular art and design that exist within social movements, their specific local histories, from the international prevalence of banners and barricades over hundreds of years, to why giant puppets became so popular in North America after 1950. The craft of protest camps internationally, especially since 2011, and different forms of hack technology. So it's a kind of people's history of art and design. It's focused on the period from 1978 on. You had a new cycle of social struggles against the emerging policies of neoliberalism, and new technologies that meant new kinds of making could take place within social movement cultures. But also a lot of objects from this the practical reason that before 1978 a lot of the objects are lost. And something, I mean, here's an example of one of the objects from the show. This was a giant inflatable cobblestone that was used in protests in Berlin and then also in Barcelona. And the group they're making some in Warsaw at the moment. And the idea was that they've been stereotyped. Oh, you can turn it down. You can keep the volume really low because everyone knows what shouting. They've been typecast as stone-throwing troublemakers for May Day demonstrations in Berlin each year. So they made their own new stone, giant cobblestone symbol of revolution since 1968. Campos, full day. And then threw it at the police. You can see the police there. They're not really sure what to do with it. It's a bit like a giant dog toy for the police. He's trying to smash it up, doesn't work. There's another great video in Spain where they try to arrest the cobblestone, trying to push it into a van and it won't fit in the door. So it's literally a very unruly object and transforms the demonstration from a moment of confrontation into something a little bit more interesting. So sometimes the protesters would throw this to the police would catch it, they're not sure what to do, so they throw it back, and the protesters catch it, and then now they're playing beach volleyball. So you have these kind of interesting moments. So, yeah, disobedient objects have a history as long as social struggle itself, and they're part of this kind of people's history of art and design from below. And during my research, I kind of discovered that working on activist art within movements, the study of objects was kind of a neglected area, and that was kind of what was interesting to me. So if you want to find the radical stuff in a museum, you go to the prints department. At the end of the 19th century, museums began collecting prints and posters. They seemed like an exciting modern medium. They had something of like public life about them. But they're also a form used by political movements. So it's in the form of posters that the movement cultures kind of slip under the door of the museum and begin to be archived there. And there's also like, it's very easy for kind of you to keep a poster under your bed for like 30 years and then pull it out and go, oh, maybe someone cares about this. If you've got a giant puppet, you probably put it in the bin. So like it was interesting. That began a discussion with my co-curator at the museum about what it would mean to make an exhibition of all these other objects. We couldn't call the exhibition everything except posters because that doesn't sound very good. But that was kind of the premise of the show. What about all the other objects of social movements? And we wanted to think about kind of the qualities of the objects in their own terms. So not exactly, there's these debates at the moment around design activism, which we wanted to kind of avoid, or about art activism, which is often an even vaguer term. It could mean anything. A kind of social practice, a kind of participatory art, it could mean street art. It's a very fuzzy term. But we also tried to avoid the term activism. Again, that it's often the term if you look at kind of shows about political art, there's been a real trend for them over the last, 10 years, certainly in Europe. And activism then tends to function as a kind of enclosure of authenticity or of cultural capital by designers, by artists, NGOs, celebrities. Who doesn't want to be an activist, right? It sounds, I don't know what the opposite of that would be. It's something no one wants to be there. So we tried to, again, avoid this term as something that was a little bit tainted, and then there's various kind of publications by activists kind of trying to reject this as an identity, as if it's a job or a professionalized role that they should take on. So we looked, these objects in their own terms. So here, this is the first case that you'd see in the show, where we tried to raise the issue that many of these objects are simply kind of appropriated commodities. So you have the cacerola, the pan lid, from Argentina in 2001. People would take these and bang them in the streets, a tradition that goes back to Chile in the 1970s as a mode of performing protest. But also sometimes if you need to design a new object to create a new way to disobey, so something like the inflatable cobblestone. So we paired it with the only object that was already in the museum that kind of qualified for the exhibition. So this is a suffragette teacup. It's part of a tea service that the V&A has that's branded with the logo of the suffragette movement in the UK. So they were campaigning in the 19th century and onwards for the female vote. So you would sit down to dinner, or for tea perhaps, with this nice society lady, and as soon as she got the tea service out, you would realise she was a suffragette, and now you're going to have to talk about politics, and you were trapped by the cup of tea. So it turned this domestic interaction into a political moment, and created a new political possibility. So I can kind of run through, some of the structure of the show. The show is structured through different strategies that movements take on and how objects fit into those strategies. So 4 of those are, first of all, making worlds, the idea of prefigurative politics. So we looked at the particular architecture of different protest camps. So this is from Turkey and the Ukraine and the US. We also looked at the older strategy of speaking out against injustice and the changing design of protest placards. So you have one here from London student demonstrations on one side, and beside it a placard from Russia, anti-Putin demonstrations in 2011. And also this from the first demonstration in Russia that openly used the colours and flags of the gay pride movement in a public way in Russia. And sometimes objects which were interesting but maybe not as tied to big movement successes. So this is a graffiti writing robot from the States from 1998. So it would kind of drive along the pavement and write whatever your message was by remote control on the floor, so that if you were to write something that might get you arrested or to be doing graffiti, the robot could be arrested, and it gave you a safe operational distance. So they were inspired by kind of military bomb disposal robots and decided to make something, the money in the US is always invested in the military for robotic technology, so they wanted to invest in protest movements. What kind of robots do protesters need, and try to design some. It's an interesting experiment, but not very successful. And also, the last 2 sections on direct action, so on solving a social problem directly yourself. So these are, you see them in action here, book block shields. So these were used by international student demonstrations, but from 2010 to 2012. The first you see in the video here in Italy, where students protesting against cuts to education made shields so that they could resist the police relatively non-violently, but without admitting defeat. So they could push back. You see them doing that beautifully there against the police. But each student chose to decorate their shield with their favorite book. So they were protecting themselves with their education. And it's a kind of symbolically very clever. So all the newspapers, say in the UK for the student demonstrations, had photos like the one you see on the top left, where this moment of conflict, like the media focus on, like they say in the UK, if it bleeds, it leads. So the photo of something that's on fire or a window breaking, this generic protest photo. They knew this would be the photograph, so when the policeman strikes them, they turn that around. So the story of the battle becomes a battle over the story in the media. So the image now tells you something about what the protest was about. You have a policeman striking a book, attacking learning, and a student holding up a copy of Spectres of Marx by Jacques Derrida to protect himself, which I think is kind of amazing. And the tactics spread virally. So the first of these that we had on display is from Italy. Students in London saw them doing it on YouTube, were really inspired, and they couldn't contact them, but they said we can express our solidarity with this protest and our connection to it by making the shields as well, and they'll see us doing it, they'll see us on the news. So they made them, and then they spread so we have some from the north of England, the Oscar Wilde. They made aesthetically, I think, the best books up there, I don't know why. And then this one on the left, the To Kill a Mockingbird from New York, and you saw it in lots of other places as well. I was in Hong Kong recently and didn't even realize that some of them had seen the exhibition and started making book block shields there for part of their student demonstrations. So these things kind of travel. And another kind of example of these are pendants. These are kind of nice because I showed these to one of the V&A's collectors of silver, so jewelry, and she leaned in and said, "These are very beautiful. I like. What does this say?" And they're made by Black Panthers who are kept in solitary confinement for their political activity in America. And they design them and then have one of the other prisoners who have access to the shop, the tools, to produce the physical designs for them. And then they send them to people to express solidarity. So if you write to one of these prisoners, they'll write back to you, and that's their only kind of contact with the outside world. Apart from they're kept in a small cell, perhaps not much larger than this table, 24 hours a day. And their only kind of contact with other people is through letter writing, their kind of expression throughout the world. And we had kind of the objects of different types as well. So from kind of textiles, kind of exposing kind of pinner-stage dictatorship, to political video games that draw your attention to the manufacturing processes behind iPhones and Android phones and so on. And different banners. This was a banner that got me in trouble for putting in the exhibition. I'll tell you the story about that later, if you like. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the qualities of some of these objects. The objects are kind of unfinished in two senses. That the objects look strange in a museum like the Victoria and Albert Museum. If you've ever been there, it has a reputation as quite a conservative museum. There's lots of the stuff they display is fine craft, so there's lots of very fine ceramics, there's Greek sculptures, everything is beautiful. That's what they're concerned with, beauty. So you put something like this in the museum, and people were, they found it very strange, should we say. So these objects kind of have rough edges, and I wanted people to try and understand these objects also as examples of good design. They weren't necessarily finely crafted, but you had to understand the conditions under which they were made. They were made often under duress, physical duress. You were being attacked by the police, and they were trying in various ways, the government undermining your organization in various ways, with few resources and often under very short time pressure. And under those conditions, these objects were often very successful designs that responded to those conditions and managed to make themselves part of a process of social change, or to change what it felt like to be involved in a protest movement in quite dramatic ways. And judged by those terms of kind of impact on social change, I kind of argued that lots of the other objects in the museum were failures compared to the design of these objects. So there was this kind of other sense as well, that in which these objects were unfinished. They were rough and raw, but they were also part of social struggles, which were themselves unfinished social struggles. They were still very kind of raw for people. They were unresolved historically, and we showed many objects in the exhibition which were part of current protest movements, things that were kind of unresolved and ongoing, or even beginning during the time of the exhibition. So it made it kind of a strange, and I'll talk a little bit later about how we tried to display these objects, embracing that kind of unfinished quality. In terms of the production of these objects, I began to think about them using this term swarm design, that like the book blocks example that I showed you, these objects weren't necessarily the product of one designer or one author. It was often very difficult to work out who would first come up with an idea, and where it had come up with. But maybe one kind of story that gives an example of that is the example of lock-ons that you see here. These were guides. I'll talk about these in a little bit. We gave away guides in the exhibition for how to make these objects that you could take away with you. So lock-ons are a device. They're like a solid arm, a tube that you put your arms into, and you tie to your a very good friend. You tie your arms together inside. You can see people doing it here. It also allows people. You see a fellow in the UK in a wheelchair. It allows him to turn his wheelchair into a tool of protest as well. And it makes it very hard for the police to remove you, because they have to cut through the tube without cutting your arms off, hopefully. So it slows down the process of removal. In the UK and in much of Europe, there are specialized police teams who are trained and called in just to remove people from these kinds of devices. And there's a kind of intimate backwards and forwards of people changing the design a little bit to make it harder to cut, using different materials and so on and so forth. So there's this game of cat and mouse around these devices. But one of the other devices that emerges at the same, in fact, from the same protest as lock-ons in the 1980s, is the tactic of the tripod, which is a way of blockading a road non-violently. So I guess part of this was to think about these objects also not as just props, as something that's just incidental. Props are a kind of add-on to the real agencies of bodies. But I wanted to think about how, I mean, I guess as a disability scholar might tell you that without a prop to hold you up, that you can fall flat on your face. And to think about the way in which participation in a democracy is itself a prosthetic act. From the voting's use from movement, from using the voice to vote, to using blind ballots, cards, to the push-button voting machines used in India, which makes it possible for a larger literate population with many different languages to vote together. So social change, I think, also has its own props that make social movement possible. These objects kind of directly blockade, or they speak out more effectively, or they enable your body in some way, or perhaps like a legal aid pamphlet, allow you to negotiate the permitted space of a demonstration. So I wanted to, think about how these objects, this idea of swarm design, they don't move from a producer to a market in a circulation of commodities. Marx describes this as MCM, money, commodity, more money, but as part of a circulation of social struggles. So maybe movement, object, another movement. So if you think about the book block shields, how they circulated struggle through an object and solidarity between movements. They're kind of prototypes which exist in the wild, modified and reworked to meet the needs of different times and different places. They have a distributed collective authorship in which movements adapt tactics from each other, but modify them for new contexts. So tripods are a good example of this. This is the story I want to tell. So on the 26th of March, 1974, loggers arrived in the village of Reni in northern India, and female villagers, this is the picture you see on the left, who relied on the trees for their livelihood, tried to reason with them, but were threatened with guns. And in response, they extended Gandhi's protest methods to what they called chipko, tree hugging, a kind of bodily blockade. And their successes in forest conservation in the 1970s became a kind of strategic rallying point for the nascent ecological movement. The tactic began to spread. Later in the 1970s in New Zealand, the other photo, as part of anti-logging protests, which led to the foundation of Puera Forest Park, activists extended this tactic, this blockade tactic, but by moving out of reach, building platforms using wooden pallets high up in the trees to blockade the tree felling with the world's first ever tree sits. So, then a little later, this is the 1980s, in the southeast forests of New South Wales, Australia, there are continuing anti-logging protests. And the protesters here begin to construct what you see. This is the very first one, so it's a bad photo. Tripods using the already cut trees. So you can see maybe there are three logs laid against each other to construct a tripod that blockaded the single road into the forest that the logging trucks would use. It's effectively a tree sit without a tree. It uses the same logic of occupation, of a high point, and then removal of that person to blockade a road. So one person sits on top of the tripod, and so the idea is that you remove any of the legs, they will fall down and they'll be hurt. So it's about kind of relying on the responsibility of the person who has to move you. Now in the UK in the 1990s, some of the activists from Australia from these demonstrations and protests travelled to the UK. They made zines that showed how to make these objects, and the design travelled to protest by Reclaim the Streets, where urban activists with stronger ties to earlier tree sits in the UK began to scavenge steel scaffolding poles to make tripods again. But they used them in cities to make what they called intelligent barricades. the first on a high street in North London in 1994. The idea of it being an intelligent barricade was that it closed the road to cars, but it opened it to people. So they could hold street parties, they could bring in sound systems, and there was a kind of a particular culture of party and protest in the UK in this period. They experimented with 2 or even 1-legged tripod designs alongside complex multi-tripod kind of architectural arrangements using overlapping legs. Sometimes in counter-response to the development of specialized police removal units, which developed in the US, Asia-Pacific, and Europe. Groups have experimented with different material for this, using aluminium now instead of scaffolding poles. It's lighter, you can carry it, run into a road with it more quickly than you can, use less people to erect them. And from 2006, this is the climate camp protests in the UK, the tripod in silhouette became kind of a graphic icon of protest itself, as much as the barricade in the 19th century in Europe became an icon of revolution. And sometimes these are erected at the entrances to protest camps purely for symbolic reasons. So the ones here have no practical use. So I think of these as being part of a kind of ecology of agency. They make up part of the movement of social movements, facilitating people's ability to act. Here's one kind of much more recent example. So this is a much more complex design combining a tripod and various lock-ons, which was used last year by activists in London to blockade a runway at Heathrow Airport in protest against the proposed expansion of that airport. And they've just kind of won a court case recently. So these objects also kind of have impacts kind of on mainstream design as well. So like the inventors of Twitter kind of openly credited a project by one of the groups I already showed you called TextMob, which was in 2009 a program during a Republican convention in New York that allowed activists to be networked with each other through a text messaging service, so they could find out where police lines were forming in order to avoid them, and where direct actions, which were previously secret, were now taking place, so they could join them and get involved. And the founders of Twitter, kind of one of whom was involved in this project, then saw this as having some other wider kind of commercial application. So there's often a dynamic. There are kind of several stories like this where these kind of grassroots forms of design then feed into kind of various commercial applications later on. So it was kind of strange, like I say, to put some of these objects in the museum. And I'll maybe tell you kind of 2 stories about how that went. I'll skip ahead. So this is the other exhibition that was on at the V&A at the same time was an exhibition of wedding dresses. So if that gives you a sense of like how weird this was. And there's a photo of one of the Guerrilla Girls, an American art protest group, who when they turned up to, they were in our show, they demanded to be led around the wedding dresses show, but they wanted to keep their gorilla masks on. So this is a photo of them kind of on their tour. We involved kind of lots of activists in the design of the show and its messaging, and tried to give them, this is kind of maybe a separate story about how we put the show on in a way that kind of didn't simply recuperate those movements or use them for the museum's benefit, but made the museum responsible to the movements and allowed the movements to use the museum to speak and tell their own stories. And that kind of manifested in a few different ways. So there was a dual label system through the show where I wrote a label and got it approved by the groups who'd lent me stuff. But each group also wrote their own label saying whatever they wanted about each object. And we had agreement from the museum that they wouldn't censor whatever it was that they said, even if it upset the museum, which sometimes it did. And here is another example. So the pendant that I showed you was displayed with a letter from one of the Black Panthers in prison. So we just used that instead of the actual label. And it has his address at the top. So if you kind of read his message and were kind of moved by it, you could write back to him right away. And we kind of supplied materials for that. One of the most interesting things was these how-to guides. So around the exhibition, rather than displaying these objects as kind of things to be admired in a glass case, they were objects that anyone could make, and we wanted to kind of make that very clear. So many of the objects came with displays that showed you how to make your own version of these objects if you should want to. So this is a display on the left for a DIY tear gas mask that you can use to counter the effects of police tear gas and pepper spray, and it was being used in demonstrations in Turkey in 2011 during the Occupy Gezi demonstrations. And these 6 here, this is the exit to the show where people could kind of pick up and take away their own copies of these. They're also all available kind of online, they're easy to find. So we had guides to make a book block shield, a pamphlet bomb, which is used in South Africa in the 80s, which would kind of explode in public space and throw pamphlets into the air, a bike-based sound system, a protest drone, your own lock-on, and again, the tear gas mask. So you see a few of these here, and I'll tell you briefly a little story about the impacts that they had. One of the other ways that we tried to message this was this was like an unfinished show. It wasn't like a complete art historical survey of the best of protest or something like that. That would have been ridiculous. Was to include like a space at the end of the show that you see here. So it notes that new movements will grow during this exhibition. This space is held for future disobedient objects. So to kind of, for the curation of the show to be like a little bit humble, more humble than curators often are, about showing these objects. And I thought of it as a kind of conceptual thing that people would stop and look at it and think, oh, what else could be in here? What protests am I involved in? What have I read about? How could I adapt these different objects? But in practice, people started sticking their own objects in the space and bringing them and putting them in. To start with, they stayed within the lines, which was polite, and then as more and more came, and then people started writing on the walls, and it kind of took over a lot of the exhibition space, so all of the other exhibits had, now by the end, writing around them and slogans. The museum only got upset when the writing started to go around the corner and out into the rest of the museum, into the displays of East Asian art, from the 17th century, and at that point they said, okay, we have to stop the graffiti now, please. But it was really interesting to see people also responding. So you have people bringing objects from some protests, but people then opposing with counter objects from counter demonstrations, backwards and forwards a little bit. So some of the debates internal to leftist movements in Europe are kind of being played out through objects on the wall, which is super interesting. And you also see an umbrella with some Chinese writing on it at the bottom there, which is from the umbrella movement protest, the pro-democracy protest in Hong Kong, which broke out while the exhibition was on. We actually took that umbrella, and now when the show went on tour to Australia, that became one of the exhibits within the object, so we took it on. I'm going to skip that story. I'm going to tell this one because it's more interesting. So the tear gas mask that was in the show, again, these kind of guides were available online to download, and people started circulating them kind of because it's kind of a cool or interesting thing. But we noticed a strange spike in the number of downloads right here. You can see there, and that date is the protests in North America in Ferguson after a police officer shot a young black man again. And when protests broke out, police responded with a lot of tear gas. And somehow people found this guide circulating online that showed you how, if you were in Istanbul, you could make a gas mask of your own. And people started making them in Ferguson and distributing them to each other as a way to kind of care for each other and protect each other. It's really strange. So I don't know, I've probably not got time, but there's a little audio clip of one of the protesters in Ferguson talking about how he kind of got people together, and they started making these in a local shop. And then the design was kind of out there. So this is one of the pages for the umbrella movement protests in Hong Kong. And they manufactured them on a kind of mass scale. So they like some design students got hold of them. And in their university, they made 100 or so of these and began distributing them to people at the front lines of the protests, who were using, they're getting very heavily pepper sprayed by the police, again, as a gesture of kind of solidarity. So to me, it was kind of interesting that not only did these objects kind of communicate struggle, but the museum became a moment where it could also communicate struggle. That a museum is a place where people go to look intensely, and so in this case, people were looking at strategies from one movement and the museum amplified particular tactics which people could then take and borrow and use elsewhere in the world. It became kind of a transmitter of struggle and solidarity in a small way between movements. But I also wanted with the show to kind of point out some of the limits of an exhibition like this, that it can't capture everything. So this was one of the first quotations from the show that introduces some of the kind of power and kind of accomplishments of social movements and the way that they often aren't acknowledged. But at the same time, as the first quote in an exhibition in a kind of national museum about protest, it sounds a little bit also sarcastic, like the museum is now constructing one of those monuments in retrospect. This is a banner, again, the first political banner in the show. There were lots of them hung from the ceiling from different movements. And this one from a North of England Miners Association. And at the bottom it says, "Still the enemy within." And Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s described the miners who are on strike in the UK as the enemy within, as the communists who aren't abroad but are in our own country and we have to destroy them. And they kind of adopted this insult as a badge of pride. So you would see lots of banners and things that said, yes, we are the enemy within. So again, as the first banner in the exhibition, it maybe to some people said something about the status of this exhibition within a museum like the V&A, that this banner also, signified this exhibition as a museum within, as a museum within, as an enemy within. And this is one of the last banners, just as you can see the exit there, just as you leave the show. And it's from an anti-Putin demonstration in 2011. And it's put together by a poetry collective, and it contains a kind of play on words. It says two things at once. It says, you cannot represent us. So, Vladimir Putin, your elections are illegitimate, you can't politically represent us. But the word represent in the top right is spelled kind of playfully. So it also says, you cannot even imagine us. You can't imagine what we're capable of when we get together. But then recontextualized in this exhibition, it maybe says something at the end about the limits of an exhibition to capture the depth and complexity and vitality of these movements. That the exhibition can't represent them. It can't even imagine what they're really capable of. So I've got a little bit more time. I'm going to jump ahead. So one of the questions people asked me about disobedient objects was, what about the objects of the police? And what about the design? You've got these kind of protest shields, but what about the police shields? Do they have their own design story to tell? Can we talk about those in the same way? Could we make an exhibition like that? And I said, yeah, probably could. And the street artists, Banksy, invited me to make a museum as part of his Disneyland amusement park in London, not in London, in the UK last summer. And so he gave me a bus and said, put a museum in there. And I said, okay. And it was called the Museum of Cruel Design. So I focused on kind of the opposite story to Disobedient Objects, where Disobedient Objects had been about design for liberation and progression and for radical causes. This was looking at the role of design in social control. So this was kind of the first label. I couldn't call it Obedient Objects, it seemed too cheesy. I managed to resist that. But to think about, so maybe as an example to look at, this is one of the first displays in the show, and it's what you see down here.
The Motorola WT4000
a Motorola
is the latest in a long line of designs
which is worn
intended
by
to watch and
warehouse
control the
workers
workforce.
in the UK and in other places.
As with many new business inventions,
It
was made to stop workers fighting for better wages
these objects
and
to
conditions.
You, are wearing these on their arms. They
One
tell
of the most
them where
famous
to go in the
surveillance
warehouse,
designs
where
is the
each object is
panoptique in
stored.
prison,
But they
designed
also
by
measure
Jeremy
their
Bentham
movement, how
in the
fast
late
they
18th
take to
century.
get to pick up each object. And if they don't keep
A
up a
single
minimum
watchman
speed, so they
can
have a
view
countdown.
every cell
like
without
you have,
prisoners
you have
knowing
1 minute
if they
to
are
get the
being
next
watched
object
at
to
any
put in the
moment.
car. You scan it, you now have 1
But
minute
the
and a half
design
to get
was
the next
actually
object. So it
inspired by a
controls
factory
very
layout
intimately
made
the
by
pace of
Jeremy's
your work.
brother Samuel
It's
to
very
control
exhausting
labor.
work. So I looked at these They have a microphone in them as well. So if you're
Industrial
working too slowly,
production
your boss can
introduced
speak to
new
you
methods of
directly
control.
while you're still moving around
In
and tell you to hurry
1913,
the hell up.
Henry Ford introduced
so really
the
kind
conveyor
of,
belt production line.
Disturbing object, but also they set back
Instead of
the
making
design
a whole object
of
by
these
hand,
objects, which you find
each
in lots of
worker
increasingly
now
different
repeated a
workplaces
single
now.
unskilled
Because it
movement
looks so
along the
obviously
line.
scary and weird that many people within the industry complained about, like that it was a bad design.
Work
and that
became
kind
more
of interesting
intense,
to me,
while workers became
to look at some of these objects as bad designs, both ethically, of course, but also as often ineffective. They don't address the root causes of social problems. They try to kind of solve them in some kind of superficial way. So I looked here at these which are prevalent in the UK and the US. I haven't seen much of them here, but maybe someone can correct me. There's a kind of, these spikes that you see here are anti-homeless spikes. So you find them outside expensive shop. Yeah, you're very familiar with these. Okay, so they're actually only made by one company. Which is interesting, and it was interesting to me as a design decision that someone had to sit down and decide how spiky should an anti-homeless spike be, because it can't be razor sharp, right? That's probably still unacceptable to stab homeless people mostly, but it can't be too comfortable either. And there was an actual, there was a design decision that was bound up with legal permissions, with PR decisions around this object. I think that's a kind of interesting set of designs. And you have these on the side here, anti-skateboard studs as well, which come out of California in the 1980s by one architect who hated skateboarders and organized a workshop with other architects called Ban the Borders in order to design something that would stop skateboarders in his city. So these are kind of particularly isolated right-wing initiatives that then become somehow commercially successful as a model. And also kind of these benches, again prevalent in Europe, benches that you're not meant to sit on for very long. They're made of metal, so they're hot in the summer, cold in the winter. They're tilted at an angle, so you're not really ever sitting on them, you're just kind of resting, leaning against them, and you can't put any objects on them, a stereo or you're shopping or anything like that. They're intended to move you along in public space. And what I found interesting, you have here kind of a piece of a border fence from Meia in northern Africa, and it looks fairly innocent here. It's actually like a triple layered fence with kind of spikes and traps and automated pepper spray and tear gas built into it. It's like it's a really horrific thing. We didn't, within a bus, we didn't have space to display it. But what was interesting to me, as this kind of slightly overcomplicated diagram shows, which you can find, again, online, is that there were often connections between the design of objects to expel people from urban space, so the poor, the homeless, young people, and the control of borders for the gated communities of nation states. So if you look at the border between Mexico and the US, or the massive investment in border fences around the European border, often either particular designs or particular companies were involved in both of these processes. So there was a kind of a strange design story that linked the foreign border to the internal exclusion of populations, which we tried to kind of map out here. So the red line along the bottom is devices and designs for urban space. So things from, there's the anti-homeless spikes you see there. In the UK, they have these things called mosquito alarms, which are outside shops. They emit a very high-frequency noise that can only be heard by people under the age of 17. So it's irritating to you, but only if you're a teenager. So intended to get rid of young people. Or these blue lights, which maybe you have here, which are in toilets to stop you being able to see your veins, so that if you're in the toilet, you can't kind of inject drugs. They've been acknowledged as being not very successful because in the UK, there's a study and they said they actually encourage people to write graffiti because it glows in the dark and it looks really cool. Sometimes these designs don't work so well. And so you see the green along the top is a history of the design and the companies involved. So you see lots of company logos across this thing, of border fences around Europe and their growth and expansion in relation to particular kind of corporate investment and government initiatives of various kinds. And often these things tie backwards and forwards. So the fence, so one of the lines that you see there is there's a company who designed, which way around does it go? It goes from the Israel-Palestine border, a device that drops barbed wire from out of the back of a truck, so you can make an instant border, you can encircle a group with them, which were then, after successfully being deployed against Palestinian demonstrators, were used in the UK against people protesting against the G8 World Leaders Summit that I was at. We were kind of in a field and then saw this kind of car dropping razor wire all around us and kind of trapping us, and realized that this was, it's the same technology that travels internationally, often used domestically against protest and internationally against migrants. So maybe last of all, I'll just finish with these last two examples, was to this display at the back of a UK riot officer and the different equipment they have, which often had, for me, really interesting stories behind it. They were walking past the art gallery nearby last night, and there was a demonstration. I started getting fascinated by what gear do the cops have here. I started taking photos. I got a little bit too close. I got in trouble. I had to run away. So for example, the design of tear gas as a weapon of war. Tear gas, firstly used, you can see from the label there, in the First World War. It's actually banned for use in war, but the loophole is that it's still okay to use it on a civilian population. So you can use it on people protesting. But it's acknowledged to be legally and morally wrong to fire it at soldiers fighting at each other. And these are kind of, again, you see, we kind of tried to name the companies involved and to tie together where and how these things are being used. So we have these where the objects were made in Britain. We acknowledge that in a kind of proud way, and also actually used the logos on the displays of these things. So a lot of these objects, people didn't want to. We had to kind of find tricky ways to actually get hold of these objects, because these companies didn't want us to display these things, or we used the Freedom of Information Act, or we got them from an arms dealer or something who was willing to just send us some tear gas off the books. It's a bit weird. Or the design of rubber bullets. This is, for me, a really interesting story. These originate in Hong Kong. The colonial police British police occupying Hong Kong were no longer allowed to shoot demonstrators. That was causing too much unrest back at home. So the story goes, they cut up broom handles and fire them out of shotguns, which would hurt you and possibly kill you. But it was a way of it was like the logic was you could hit people's sticks from further away. It was the Hong Kong police were then brought to Northern Ireland to train the police there in how to control Northern Ireland, the British police again colonially occupying. And they introduced a number of kind of police tactics, including these objects. And the police in Northern Ireland said, firing wooden batons, I don't think we get away with that legally. So in this situation, perhaps we could get someone to manufacture them out of rubber. And so this is the origination of rubber bullets, or baton rounds as they're now called. And again, so we have some of those on display. The one you can see just behind is one that was fired in Northern Ireland. And again, the same company now export them, as you see around the world, to places like Bahrain for political repression. So I might stop there because I've almost run out of time. But again, last of all, we had these, you can find this again online if you're interested, a guide to, we wanted to give away another how-to guide so you can use some of the same language as disobedient objects for how to identify riot control weapons. This is now available in various languages. We'll have it in Portuguese soon. I think it's already in Spanish, and you can see it's in Arabic up there. So the idea is, this guide shows you the angles at which to photograph something. If you find it on the ground at a demonstration, you catch it from the right angles, and then you tweet the images or share them online with the hashtag RiotID, and a team of experts in the UK will tweet you back really quickly and tell you who made it, and what it is, and what's in it. So that can be useful in terms of getting medical treatment. All the companies who make these kind of various chemical irritants use they each have their own special recipe, and they don't tell you what it is. It's kind of like KFC. And so it's useful to know if you go to hospital like you're choking and what it is that some help in knowing what it is, but also principally in holding these companies to account. So we're able to discover, for example, like the tear gas used to suppress the pro-democracy demonstrations in Hong Kong the year before last was made by a company in the south of England. And then you can look up where their address is, and if you want to do something, you can go and demonstrate in solidarity with people somewhere else in the world by picking on something distinct. So you can see some kind of examples of that in use there. They're kind of tweeting back to people and identifying. So a lot of this, in Calais, used against the migrants, or used in kind of other areas of the world. So I'm going to stop there because I'm out of time. I was going to tell you a little bit about the other thing that we gave away, which you can ask me afterwards. It's these ad space hack packs, which we sold also for £5, which let you break into any advertising space pretty much in the world. So that the design of outdoor advertising spaces is pretty standardized because it's only done by 5 companies thanks to globalization. So if you have 3 keys, you can open almost all of them. You can still buy these online. It's a little advert if you search for ad space hack pack. And we sold them at Disneyland to kind of families and children and whoever wanted one, really. And people did different things with them. But the most interesting thing, I mean, some people used them to for someone's birthday, like to put all around their house all the adverts for pictures of their face or something like this. But also there was, at the same time as the Disneyland exhibition on, there was an arms trade fair exhibition in London, which had no advertising because obviously it's something they don't want to publicise. It's something the UK government funds, but they only, the public can't attend. You can only attend if you're perhaps from Bahrain or somewhere and you want to buy something that really is used for like taking people's eyes out or something like this. They sell torture weapons and everything else. So I asked the different artists at Disneyland if they'd like to design adverts for the arms trade fair, and they designed about 300 of them. They really got excited about it, and we got people to use these same kits just to prove that they worked, to put them up all over London. This is Oxford Street, like the main shopping street in London, to advertise the fair, let people know that it was going on. It became kind of a news story at the time. All right, so I'm out of time. I'm going to stop there. Thanks very much.